Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. My girlfriend and I almost never talk about that night anymore. Even now, years later, just mentioning it makes both of us uneasy. It is not because anything supernatural actually happened. In fact, we both know exactly what caused it. But fear does not always care about logic. Some moments burn into your memory so deeply that even after you understand them, the feeling they created never completely disappears. To this day, the area around our bedroom door still gives us a strange feeling late at night. Sometimes we catch ourselves glancing over there before going to sleep. We even kept the lights on for a long time after it happened. Not because we believed there was something there, but because that moment of confusion and fear had been so intense that the memory alone was enough to make us uncomfortable. The night it happened was completely ordinary before everything went wrong. It was around 2 in the morning. We had been asleep for several hours, the kind of deep sleep where you are completely unaware of the world around you. The room was dark and quiet. Our mattress was on the floor because we had recently moved in and hadn't finished setting everything up yet. Boxes were still stacked around parts of the apartment. Towels, clothes, random items we had not found places for yet were scattered around. Then suddenly we were both ripped out of sleep by a sound so loud that it physically hurt. An alarm exploded into the room. It was not a gentle beep or a soft notification sound. It was piercing. The kind of noise that cuts through your skull and sends your heart into overdrive before your brain even has time to understand what is happening. In 1 second, we went from deep sleep to full adrenaline. My chest felt like it had been hit with electricity. My ears rang. The noise filled every corner of the room. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. When you wake up suddenly like that, the brain can take a few seconds to reconnect with reality. The darkness of the room felt unfamiliar. My thoughts were scrambled. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then I saw something. Standing in the bedroom doorway was a figure. It looked like a child. Small, thin, long hair hanging down around its head. For a split second, my brain accepted it as real. "Who the fuck is that?" I screamed. My voice cracked somewhere between a shout and panic. The adrenaline flooding through my body made it impossible to think clearly. My girlfriend sat up instantly, just as disoriented as I was. "Where? Where?" she shouted. I was pointing toward the doorway, shaking. "What the fuck is that?" I yelled again. By that point, I was practically yell-crying. The fear was so sudden and overwhelming that it bypassed logic completely. My brain had already decided that someone, or something, was standing in our doorway. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. That almost made it worse. The alarm was still screaming in the background. My ears felt like they were vibrating from the sound. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run or fight, but I couldn't even process what I was looking at. The light switch was right next to the door, right beside the figure. That meant if I wanted to see clearly what it was, I would have to get up and move directly toward it. Our mattress was on the floor, so I had to physically push myself up from the ground. My muscles felt stiff and shaky. I forced myself to move, even though every instinct in my body told me to stay where I was. The figure still didn't move. I remember thinking, if that thing moves even a little, I don't know what I'm going to do. I reached the wall and slapped the light switch. The room filled with light instantly. And just like that, the terrifying figure in the doorway disappeared. Or rather, it transformed. What I had thought was a child with long hair was actually a towel hanging from the doorknob. The towel had draped down in a way that perfectly mimicked a small body. The folds of the fabric looked like hair in the darkness. The shape was exactly the right height to resemble a small person standing in the doorway. Once the light was on, it was obvious. It was just a towel. The alarm continued to scream overhead while both of us sat there, trying to catch our breath. We looked at each other and then back at the doorway. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. The fear didn't vanish immediately just because we understood what we were looking at. Our bodies were still flooded with adrenaline. Our hands were shaking. Our hearts were still racing. Eventually, we figured out that the alarm was coming from the smoke detector. We had just moved into the apartment, and we had never heard that specific alarm before. Smoke detectors make an unbelievably loud noise when triggered. When they go off suddenly in the middle of the night, they can be disorienting enough to feel like an emergency. We spent the next several minutes trying to figure out why it had gone off. There was no smoke, no fire, nothing burning. To this day, we still aren't completely sure what triggered it. Sometimes dust, low batteries, or electrical issues can set them off randomly. At the time, though, it felt like the entire situation had unfolded in the most terrifying sequence possible. First, the explosive alarm, then the sudden awakening from deep sleep, then the darkness of the room, then the silhouette in the doorway. Our brains had filled in the missing pieces before logic could catch up. Psychologists actually have a name for experiences like that. When you wake suddenly from deep sleep, especially during REM sleep, the brain is still partially in dream mode. Visual processing is not fully calibrated yet. The mind tries to interpret shapes and shadows quickly to identify threats. That is why objects in dark rooms can sometimes look like people or animals. A pile of clothes becomes a crouched figure. A coat on a chair looks like someone sitting there. A towel on a doorknob becomes a child standing in the doorway. In our case, the sudden alarm made everything worse. The brain had no time to adjust. The adrenaline response kicked in instantly. Our fight-or-flight system activated before we even knew what was happening. When the brain is in that state, it prioritizes survival over accuracy. It sees a shape. It assumes danger. Even though we both knew within seconds that it was just a towel, the emotional impact of that moment stuck with us. The feeling of looking into the darkness and believing, even for a moment, that someone unknown was standing there watching us. That feeling doesn't vanish easily. For weeks afterward, we kept the lights on when we slept. Not because we believed there was something supernatural in the apartment, but because that memory lingered. Even now, the doorway sometimes catches our attention late at night. It is funny in a way. If someone told the story quickly, it sounds almost silly. A towel mistaken for a child-shaped figure in the dark. A smoke detector waking two people in the middle of the night. But when you experience it in the moment, it is completely different. The brain doesn't calmly analyze shadows when adrenaline is pumping through your body. It reacts instantly, emotionally, and powerfully. And sometimes that reaction is so strong that even years later, the memory of that fear can still give you chills. Even though we both know exactly what happened, even though we know there was never anything standing there at all. About 20 years ago, when I was 8 years old, something happened that stayed with me for the rest of my life. Even now, as an adult, I still cannot sleep comfortably in a room where the windows are uncovered at night. If there are no curtains or blinds closed, I feel uneasy. I always imagine someone standing outside, watching. At the time, I lived in San Diego, California. My dad was in the Navy, so we were living in military housing. The neighborhood was quiet and full of families just like ours. Most of the houses looked similar. The streets were neat and orderly, and during the day it felt like a safe place for kids to ride bikes, play outside, and visit each other's homes. But that sense of safety can change very quickly when you are a child. One night, a friend of mine was sleeping over at our house. Sleepovers were always exciting for us back then. We would stay up later than usual, talk about random things, and play with our toys long after we were supposed to be asleep. On that particular night, we were in the living room playing with our Barbie dolls. It was late, around 2 in the morning. The house was quiet because everyone else had already gone to bed. The lights in the living room were still on, casting a warm glow across the carpet where we sat. From where we were playing, we could see into the dining room area. The living room and dining room were basically one large open space. There was no wall separating them, just a change in how the room was arranged. Along the wall of the dining room were 3 very large windows that stretched from the floor almost all the way up to the ceiling. At the time, those windows had no curtains and no blinds. They were completely uncovered. That meant anyone standing outside could see straight into the house. As children, we didn't really think about that most of the time. During the day, my sunlight would pour through those windows and make the house feel bright and open. But at night, the situation was very different. When the inside lights were on and the outside was dark, the windows became like mirrors from the inside and display screens from the outside. Anyone out there could see everything we were doing. While my friend and I were sitting on the floor playing with our dolls, I suddenly felt something strange. It is hard to explain exactly what it was. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't something I saw at first. It was the feeling that someone was watching. Children sometimes notice things before adults do. Maybe it is instinct, or maybe it is just imagination. But the feeling was strong enough that I stopped playing and slowly turned my head toward the windows. What I saw is something I will never forget. Standing outside the middle window was a man. Even now, so many years later, I can picture him clearly in my mind. He was a white man, and I remember that because he was wearing a dark blue short-sleeved t-shirt, and the sleeves exposed his forearms. His arms were fairly hairy, which stood out to me at the time because it made him look older and stronger than the adults I usually saw. The shirt also had a small pocket on the chest. He was wearing black gloves, and over his face was a black ski mask. The way he was standing made the moment even more disturbing. He had pressed his face up close to the glass of the window. Both of his hands were raised to either side of his face, creating a kind of shield against the reflection of the streetlights. By blocking the glare, he could see more clearly into the room. He was staring directly at us, not casually looking, not passing by, watching, completely focused. For a second, I didn't move. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I had never seen anything like that before. A masked man standing silently outside the house in the middle of the night, watching 2 little girls playing. Then the fear hit me all at once. I screamed as loud as I possibly could. the kind of scream that comes straight from pure panic. My body reacted before my mind could even form words. I curled up into a tight ball on the floor, shaking. My friend immediately did the same thing. She had not seen the man yet, but my reaction scared her enough that she started crying right away. Through sobs, she asked what we were supposed to do. Even though I was terrified, part of me knew we had to get help. My dad was upstairs sleeping. If we could get to him, he would know what to do. So I told my friend that we were going to count to 3 and then run upstairs as fast as we could. The idea of moving toward the staircase meant getting up and turning our backs toward the windows for a moment. That alone felt frightening. But staying there wasn't an option. We started counting together. 1, 2. I didn't even wait for 3. The moment I said 2, I jumped up and ran. I sprinted toward the stairs as fast as my 8-year-old legs could carry me. My friend ran right behind me. We were both screaming and crying as we raced up the staircase. We burst into my dad's bedroom without knocking. He woke up instantly. Seeing 2 children standing there, hysterical and crying in the middle of the night, would wake anyone up immediately. We tried to explain what had happened, speaking over each other in panic. We told him that there was a man outside the window staring at us. A man wearing a mask. My dad didn't hesitate. He jumped out of bed and rushed downstairs immediately. From there, he went straight outside toward the backyard area, which was where the man would have been standing. By the time he got there, the man was gone. There was no one outside. No sign of movement. Just the quiet darkness of the backyard and the distant glow of streetlights. My dad checked the area carefully, but whoever had been standing there had already disappeared into the night. At the time, the experience was simply terrifying. As a child, you don't always understand the full danger of a situation. You only know that something felt wrong and frightening. But years later, when I was older, I told the story to my mom. My parents had divorced, but my mom still lived in the same general area at that time. When I described what had happened, she listened carefully, and then told me something that made the memory even more unsettling. She remembered hearing about a rapist who had been active in that area around the same time we were living there. The description of the suspect matched what I had seen that night. A man wearing a mask and gloves who had been seen watching houses and looking through windows. When she said that, a cold feeling went through me. I realized how much worse the situation could have been. If that man had been bold enough to stand outside the window and watch us for that long, it meant he had probably been observing the house before that moment as well. He may have been waiting for the right opportunity. Maybe he expected everyone inside to be asleep. Instead, he found 2 children awake in the living room. Even now, the thought of it is unsettling. The image of his face pressed against the glass, his hands blocking the reflection so he could see us clearly, is something I still remember vividly. That night changed how I feel about windows. To many people, uncovered windows simply let in light and create a nice view. But to me, especially at night, they feel like openings where someone outside could be watching without being noticed. That is why I always close curtains or blinds after dark. It is not superstition. It is not paranoia. It is simply a habit formed by a moment in childhood when I realized how easily someone outside can see inside a brightly lit room. What happened that night might have only lasted a few seconds, but it left a permanent mark on how I think about safety. And every time I close the curtains before going to bed, I still remember that masked face staring through the glass. When I first moved to Los Angeles, I was excited, but also a little nervous. It was my first apartment living completely on my own. The city was huge compared to where I had lived before, and everything felt new and unfamiliar. The streets were always busy. The nights were louder than what I was used to. And even the apartment building had a different kind of energy than the homes I had grown up in. At first, the apartment seemed perfectly normal. It was not very big, but it was enough for one person. There was a small living room, a kitchen that barely fit a table, and a bedroom tucked in the back. The place had that typical Los Angeles apartment look. Slightly older walls, wooden floors that creaked in certain spots, and windows that let in a lot of light during the day. During the daytime, everything felt fine. I would open the windows, let the sun fill the rooms, and go about my day like anyone else settling into a new place. But once night came, something about the apartment began to feel different. It started as a small feeling that I could not really explain. I often felt like I was being watched. There was never anything I could point to as proof. No strange noises, no objects moving, no shadows doing anything unusual. But the feeling would appear when I was alone, especially late at night. It was like a quiet sense that someone else was present in the room, even though I knew logically that I was by myself. Because of that feeling, I developed a strange habit without even realizing it. I didn't like sleeping with my back toward the bedroom door. If I lay facing away from the door, I would feel uncomfortable, almost like I was leaving myself exposed to something I couldn't see. So I started positioning myself in bed so that I could see the door from where I was lying. It wasn't something I consciously decided to do at first. It just felt safer that way. Whenever I was on the phone with someone or had friends visiting, the feeling disappeared. When the apartment was full of conversation or laughter, it felt completely normal. But the moment I was alone again, that strange sense of being watched would return. I tried to ignore it. Living alone for the first time can make people more sensitive to small things. Every sound in an apartment building becomes noticeable. Pipes in the walls, footsteps from upstairs neighbors, the hum of appliances. I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to a new environment. But even after weeks passed, the uneasy feeling never fully went away. Then one night something happened that I still think about even now. It was the middle of the night. I don't know the exact time, but it must have been very late because the city outside was unusually quiet. I was asleep in my bed when suddenly I became aware of someone entering the room. When I opened my eyes, I saw an elderly man walking into my bedroom. He looked calm, almost gentle. He wore glasses and had a slight stoop in his posture, the way older people sometimes do when their backs have started to curve with age. His hair was thin and gray. The overall impression he gave was not threatening. If anything, he looked like someone's grandfather. What struck me most was his expression. He looked surprised to see me there, as if he had entered the room expecting it to be empty. For some reason, instead of feeling terrified, I felt oddly calm. It was as though my mind had already accepted the situation as something normal, even though it clearly wasn't. I spoke to him. I said something like, "It's fine. Everything's fine." My voice sounded quiet and relaxed, almost reassuring. The old man seemed relieved by what I said. He nodded slightly and replied in a soft voice, "Oh, okay." Then he looked a little embarrassed, almost apologetic, as though he had walked into the wrong place. He slowly backed away out of the room. And that was it. I must have fallen back asleep immediately afterward because the next thing I remember is waking up the next morning with sunlight coming through the window. When I thought about what had happened, I assumed it had just been a dream. A very vivid dream, yes, but still a dream. Dreams can sometimes feel incredibly real, especially when you wake up during them. The brain can create detailed faces, voices, and movements that seem almost indistinguishable from reality. I told myself that was probably what had happened. So I got up, went about my day, and tried not to think too much about it. About a week later, I ran into my landlord outside the building. We exchanged the usual polite conversation people have in those situations. At some point during the conversation, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked him a simple question. I asked who had lived in my apartment before I moved in. The landlord thought about it for a moment and said that there had been a young woman who lived there for a few months before me. He said she stayed about 4 months and then moved out. Then he added something else. He said that before her, the apartment had been empty for quite a long time. That made me curious. Apartments in Los Angeles usually don't stay empty for very long. There is always someone looking for a place to live. So I asked him why it had been vacant for so long. He told me that the previous owner of the building had lived in that apartment. Apparently, the man had lived there for many years before eventually moving to a nursing home when his health declined. Not long after moving there, he passed away. The apartment stayed empty for quite a while after that. As the landlord explained this, I felt a strange chill run through me. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked him another question. I asked him what the man had looked like. The landlord began describing him casually. He said the man had been elderly, wore glasses, and had a slightly stooped posture. He mentioned that he was known around the building as a kind, quiet person. As he continued describing the man, I felt my face grow pale. Every detail matched exactly the person I had seen in my bedroom that night. The glasses, the way he walked, the gentle expression on his face. I didn't say much after that. I just nodded and ended the conversation shortly afterward. For a long time, I thought about what might have happened that night. The most logical explanation is that it was simply a dream. When we move into a new place, our brains absorb a lot of information about the environment around us. Sometimes those impressions appear in dreams as unfamiliar figures or imagined occupants. It is also possible that my subconscious mind had picked up on clues about the apartment's history. Maybe I had heard someone mention the previous owner without consciously remembering it. The brain can store small details and later build them into dream imagery. There is also the psychological factor of living alone for the first time. The feeling of being watched might have been my mind reacting to the quiet and unfamiliar surroundings. But even with those explanations, the experience still feels unusual. In the dream, the man didn't act threatening or mysterious. He behaved exactly like someone who had walked into a room he believed still belonged to him. And when he realized someone else was there, he politely left. Whether it was just a dream or something else, I never saw him again. But for a while after that, the apartment felt a little less unsettling. The strange feeling of being watched slowly faded away. Maybe it was because I had finally attached a story to the feeling. Or maybe it was because the old man had simply realized the apartment belonged to someone new. When I was in high school, I lived with my parents in a quiet, rural area. Life there was slower than in a big city. Most of the houses were spread out across long roads with fields, woods, and small clusters of homes scattered between them. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors. And when something serious happened, people often had to rely on each other for help. My dad was a volunteer firefighter in our community. In rural areas, volunteer firefighters play a huge role in emergency response. There aren't always large, fully staffed fire departments nearby, so local volunteers step up to help when something goes wrong. Fires, accidents, medical emergencies. Whenever someone called for help, the volunteers would get the alert and head out as quickly as possible. Because of that, we had a pager in our house. This pager was connected to the local fire department and ambulance service. Whenever someone in the area called in an emergency, the dispatcher would send out a page that went to every firefighter and paramedic in the network. The pager would suddenly burst into noise, followed by a message describing the situation and location of the emergency. Growing up around that pager meant we were used to hearing it go off at random times. Sometimes during dinner, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night when everyone else was asleep. Whenever it went off, my dad would immediately listen to the message and decide whether he needed to respond. My bedroom was downstairs in the house. The pager, however, was usually kept upstairs near the main living area, so my dad could hear it easily. That meant when the pager activated, the sound echoed through the entire house. As a teenager, I often stayed up late playing video games or watching movies. Late nights were normal for me back then, especially during weekends or school breaks. The house would be quiet, everyone else asleep, and I would be downstairs with the glow of the TV lighting up the room. Whenever the pager went off, it always caught my attention. There was something intense about those alerts. The sudden burst of sound, followed by a voice describing an emergency somewhere nearby, it made you realize that while the house might feel calm and safe, something serious could be happening just a few miles away. Because my bedroom was downstairs, I developed a little routine. Whenever the pager went off while I was awake, I would run up the stairs so I could hear the message more clearly. I was curious about what was happening and where my dad might be heading. Most of the time, the messages were fairly straightforward. Motor vehicle accident on Route 14. Possible structure fire on Maple Road. Medical emergency at the corner of Pine and 3rd. The dispatcher's voice was usually calm and professional. Even when the situation sounded serious, the message itself was delivered in a steady tone. But one night, something different happened. I had been up late again, probably gaming or watching something. The house was completely quiet. Everyone else had gone to bed hours earlier. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the house settling and the soft hum of electronics. Suddenly, the pager went off. The sound was loud and sharp, me echoing through the house and snapping me out of whatever I had been doing. Like usual, I immediately ran upstairs. I made it almost all the way to the top of the stairs just as the message began. But instead of the usual calm dispatcher voice, what came through the pager was something completely different. It was a woman screaming, an elderly woman. Her voice was filled with panic and heartbreak in a way I had never heard before. She kept crying out the same words over and over again. No, no, oh no, oh no, no, no. Her voice cracked with desperation. You could hear the raw emotion in every word. It wasn't the kind of yelling people do when they're simply upset or angry. It was the kind of sound that comes from someone who has just experienced something truly terrible. There was so much grief and shock in her voice that it sent chills down my spine instantly. I froze at the top of the stairs. For a moment, I didn't even breathe. The message continued for a few seconds, but those screams were the part that stuck with me the most. Eventually, the dispatcher's voice returned, trying to gather information and coordinate the response, but my mind was still focused on that woman's voice. Even now, years later, I can still remember how it sounded. The house suddenly felt very different after that. Before hearing that message, emergency calls had always felt a little distant to me. Even though they happened nearby, they were still just brief announcements coming from a pager. They felt almost abstract. But hearing that woman's voice made everything feel painfully real. Somewhere nearby, something terrible had happened. Someone had just experienced a moment of shock or loss so intense that it came through clearly even over a small electronic device. I remember standing there for a while, trying to process what I had just heard. Eventually, my dad got up to respond to the call, but I don't remember the details of where he went or what the situation was. Volunteer firefighters often leave quickly during emergencies, and sometimes they don't share every detail afterward, especially if the incident involves something tragic. That night, though, I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of that woman screaming. When I went back downstairs and tried to go to bed, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again. No, no, oh no, oh no, no, no. The emotion behind it was so intense that it stuck in my mind like an echo. It was the kind of sound that makes you imagine the worst possibilities. As a teenager, I had not been exposed to many truly tragic situations yet. That pager message was probably one of the first times I had heard someone express that level of grief and panic in real time. It made me realize something important about the work my dad and the other volunteers were doing. Every time that pager went off, it meant someone's life had suddenly taken a frightening turn. Sometimes it was just a small accident or a medical scare, but sometimes it was something much worse. People called for help at the worst moments of their lives, moments of shock, fear, injury, or loss. And those volunteers would drop whatever they were doing, sleeping, eating, spending time with family, and rush out the door to help. After that night, I never listened to those pager messages the same way again. Before, they had been interesting or exciting to hear. They felt like part of the background of growing up in a small community with volunteer responders. But hearing that woman's voice changed that perspective. It reminded me that every call represented real people and real pain. Even though I never found out exactly what had happened that night, the memory of that moment stayed with me for a long time. Not because it was supernatural or mysterious, but because it was a raw glimpse into someone else's worst moment. And sometimes, hearing something like that once is enough to make it impossible to forget. About 3 years ago, I experienced something that I still cannot fully explain. Even now, whenever I think back to that night, the memory feels strangely vivid. Some details have faded slightly over time, but the main part of what we saw is still clear in my mind. It was one of those moments where something happens so unexpectedly that your brain struggles to understand it. And even years later, you are left wondering what it could have been. At the time, a friend of mine and I had been spending the evening at our local pub. It was the kind of place we had gone to countless times before. In a small coastal community like ours, the pub was one of the main social spots where everyone gathered after work or on weekends. The atmosphere was always relaxed. You would see familiar faces almost every time you walked in. That night was no different. We had been sitting there for several hours, talking, laughing, and drinking like we usually did. Nothing unusual had happened while we were there. It was just another ordinary night with friends. Eventually, closing time came, and the staff started encouraging everyone to head home. My friend invited me back to his house to stay the night. It wasn't uncommon for us to do that after a late night out, especially since getting back to my own place would have taken much longer. Where we lived was a rural, coastal area. The houses were spread out, and the roads curved along the hills and shoreline. If we followed the regular road route to his place, it would have taken about 40 minutes to walk there. But there was a shortcut. Between the pub and his house was a large wooded area that stretched across roughly 70 acres of land. A path cut through the woods from one side to the other. Locals had been using it for years. If you knew the route well, it could reduce the walk to about 20 minutes. We had taken that path dozens of times before. Even at night, it never really bothered us. The trees were thick, but the trail was familiar. When you grow up around a place like that, you eventually learn every turn, every clearing, and every landmark along the way. So when we left the pub around 1 in the morning, we decided to take the usual shortcut through the woods. It was summer, and the night air was warm and comfortable. The sky was clear, and there was enough moonlight filtering through the trees that we could see where we were going even without flashlights. The sound of the wind moving through the branches was gentle, almost calming. About halfway across the woods, there was a clearing that we always liked to stop at. It was one of the few open areas in the forest. The ground there sloped steeply downward, and if you stood near the top edge and looked out across the open space, you could see all the way toward the sea in the distance. On clear nights, the view from that spot was beautiful. We stopped there for a few minutes like we had many times before. We were in no hurry, and since the weather was nice, it felt good to pause and enjoy the quiet. We stood near the edge of the clearing and shared a joint while looking out toward the distant water. The far side of the clearing was less than 100 yards away, and beyond that, the trees continued down the hill. At first, everything felt normal, but after a few minutes, something started to feel different. It is hard to explain exactly what changed. Nothing in the environment had obviously shifted. The wind was still moving through the leaves. The night sky still looked clear and peaceful. Yet both of us felt it. An uneasy feeling. Neither of us spoke about it at first. We were standing there quietly, staring out toward the tree line on the other side of the clearing. And I remember realizing that several minutes had passed without either of us saying a single word. It was strange because normally we were always talking about something. But that night we both seemed to sense that something about the place felt wrong. Of course, being two young guys, neither of us wanted to admit that we were feeling nervous. Instead, we just stood there pretending everything was fine while silently scanning the darkness between the trees. Then I noticed movement. At first it was faint, a dim shape moving slowly among the trees on the far side of the clearing. I narrowed my eyes, trying to focus on it. What I saw did not look like any animal I recognized. It was roughly 4 or 5 feet tall, but it didn't seem to have a solid shape. Instead, it looked like a loose, shifting form that gave off a dim, silvery glow. The best way I can describe it is as a kind of glowing shape, almost like a blob of pale light drifting through the trees. The light it gave off wasn't bright, but it was strong enough to cast faint shadows across the clearing. I froze. The thing was moving slowly along the edge of the woods. It weaved between the trees, appearing and disappearing behind trunks and branches. As it moved, the shadows across the clearing shifted with it. For about 20 seconds, I stood there completely still, barely breathing. I was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it some kind of animal reflecting moonlight in a strange way? Was it a trick of my eyes? Finally, I glanced over at my friend. His face was turned toward the same spot in the trees. He was staring at it, too. Even more unsettling was the fact that I could see the shifting shadows cast by the glowing shape moving across his face. That meant the light source was real enough to affect the surroundings. Neither of us spoke. The silence made the moment feel even more intense. For another 10 seconds, the thing continued moving along the edge of the clearing. Then suddenly it stopped. There was a brief moment where everything seemed perfectly still. Then it flashed. A sudden burst of bright white light appeared where the shape had been. In the next instant, whatever it was shot upward into the tree canopy at incredible speed. It moved so fast that I barely had time to process what I had seen. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, disappearing somewhere above the trees. And just like that, it was over. The entire event lasted maybe 30 seconds. The only sound during that entire time had been the wind moving through the branches. After it vanished, we both remained standing there in complete silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. About a minute passed before I finally reached out and tugged on my friend's sleeve. I didn't say anything. I just gestured that we should keep moving. Neither of us wanted to stay in that clearing any longer. We continued along the path through the woods without speaking. The walk felt completely different now. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow seemed suspicious. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees around us. My mind kept racing with questions. What had we just seen? Where had it gone? Was it something natural that we simply didn't understand? Or had our eyes played some kind of strange trick on us? For the next 10 minutes, we walked in tense silence. Finally, we reached the edge of the woods and stepped out onto the main road. The streetlights illuminated the pavement, and the familiar sight of houses nearby made the world feel normal again. As soon as we were back in that safe, well-lit environment, we looked at each other. Both of our faces were pale. Almost immediately, we started talking at the same time. Each of us described exactly what we had seen. The descriptions matched perfectly. He had seen the same glowing shape moving through the trees. He had seen the bright flash. He had watched it shoot upward into the canopy. He also admitted that the moment we had arrived in the clearing, he had felt a sudden sense of unease. The same strange feeling I had noticed. That part might have been a coincidence, or maybe our brains were reacting to something subtle in the environment that we couldn't consciously identify. But the glowing shape was harder to explain. We stayed up most of the night talking about it, trying to figure out what it could have been. Over the years, we have considered many possibilities. Some people talk about natural light phenomena that can appear in forests, such as bioluminescent insects or gases that create strange glowing effects. Others suggest reflections of distant lights moving through fog or moisture in the air. But none of the explanations we found seemed to fully match what we saw. The movement, the glow, and the sudden burst of light followed by that incredible upward speed all remain difficult to explain. To this day, neither of us claims it was anything supernatural. There are many things in nature that people do not immediately recognize when they encounter them under unusual conditions. But the experience was unsettling enough that I changed one habit afterward. Now, I no longer walk through those woods at night. During the daytime, the forest looks completely ordinary. But after that night, the memory of that glowing shape moving silently among the trees is something I have never been able to forget. A few years ago, my college roommate told me a story that completely changed the way I think about remote places. He was someone who loved the outdoors. He had grown up hunting, hiking, and camping. He was even an Eagle Scout, which meant he had spent years learning survival skills, wilderness safety, and how to stay calm in unpredictable environments. If anyone I knew felt comfortable deep in the woods, it was him. That is why the story stuck with me so much. It came from someone who was not easily scared by nature. According to him, the experience happened during a camping trip in rural Mississippi. Not the tourist areas or state parks that attract families and hikers, but the deeper countryside where the roads thin out and the forests stretch for miles. He described it as the kind of place locals sometimes call the sticks. meaning an area far removed from towns, highways, or anything resembling a city. He and a friend had planned a simple overnight camping trip. The goal was just to get away from school stress and spend some time outdoors. They loaded their gear into a truck and drove for several hours until they reached a dirt road that led toward a wooded area they had heard about. The place wasn't exactly a secret camping spot, but it wasn't officially maintained either. According to what they had heard, people from nearby communities sometimes used the area for fishing, hunting, or camping. At the time, that didn't seem strange to them. In many rural parts of the United States, informal outdoor spots like that are common. Eventually, they reached a clearing where they could leave the truck. From there, they grabbed their packs and walked deeper into the woods to set up their campsite. The walk wasn't long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but it was enough to put them well out of sight of the road. The forest was dense and quiet, the kind of place where the only sounds during the day are insects, birds, and the wind moving through the trees. They set up their tent, arranged their gear, and started a small campfire. The evening felt peaceful. As the sun went down, the forest grew darker, and the temperature cooled slightly. They cooked some food, talked about school, and relaxed the way people usually do on camping trips. Nothing about the situation seemed unusual. Night eventually settled in completely. In a place that remote, the darkness is much deeper than what people experience in towns or cities. There are no streetlights, no distant glow from buildings, nothing except the faint light from the moon and stars filtering through the trees. At some point, they decided to turn in for the night. The fire had burned down, and the woods had grown quiet again. They climbed into their tent and tried to get some sleep. That was when things began to feel wrong. My roommate said he woke up after hearing something outside the tent. At first, he thought it was an animal moving through the leaves. When you camp in wooded areas, that kind of noise happens all the time. Small animals rustle around at night, and sometimes larger animals move through the forest as well. But this sound was different. He listened carefully and realized he could hear voices, men talking. The voices were not loud, but they were clear enough that he could tell they were close by. They sounded like they were communicating with each other in short, quiet sentences. At the same time, he could hear movement in the leaves and grass nearby. The combination of voices and footsteps immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. People sometimes hike through woods at night, but usually they carry flashlights or headlamps. It is almost impossible to navigate safely through dense forest in total darkness. But whoever these men were, they didn't seem to be using lights. That detail bothered him the most. He slowly reached for the sidearm he carried with him. In many rural areas, it is common for campers or hunters to carry a firearm for protection against wildlife or emergencies. As someone experienced in outdoor activities, he was trained to stay calm and assess situations carefully. He gently motioned to his friend to stay quiet. The voices continued. They were close enough now that he could hear the direction they were coming from. Leaves were crunching underfoot, and branches shifted as someone pushed through the undergrowth. He realized something else as he listened more carefully. The men weren't just walking past the campsite. They seemed to be moving around it. The sounds came from different directions, as if people were spreading out. That was the moment he decided to quietly leave the tent and take a look. Moving slowly and carefully, he slipped outside and crouched low near the edge of the campsite. His eyes strained to adjust to the darkness as he looked through the trees. In the distance, he saw shapes, several men. Even in the limited light, he could see that they were carrying weapons. Some appeared to have rifles or shotguns slung over their shoulders. They weren't shining lights, and they weren't talking loudly anymore. They were moving quietly through the woods. Then he heard something else. Movement from the left side, and another sound from the right. It suddenly became clear that these men were not simply passing through. They seemed to be surrounding the area. At that point, my roommate knew they had to leave immediately. He quietly returned to the tent and whispered to his friend that they needed to get out of there. There was no time to pack everything properly. They grabbed only the essentials: food, water, and a few small items they could carry quickly. Everything else was left behind. They slipped away from the campsite and started moving back toward the direction where they had parked the truck. The forest felt completely different now. Every step had to be taken carefully to avoid making noise. Branches snapped underfoot if they moved too quickly, and dry leaves could betray their position. They moved as quietly as they could. Not far from the path leading to their truck, they passed near a set of railroad tracks that ran through the woods. The tracks cut through the forest in a straight line, open enough that moonlight reached the ground. As my roommate glanced toward the tracks, he saw someone standing there, a large, heavy-set man. The man was holding a shotgun. He stood directly beside the rails, watching them. The man didn't say a word. Instead, he slowly tapped the end of the shotgun barrel against the metal rail. The sound echoed softly in the night. Metal against metal. Tap, tap, tap. My roommate said the man's expression was completely blank. No anger, no surprise. Just a cold stare. The moment felt incredibly tense. Something about the way the man watched them made it clear that they were not welcome there. My roommate later said that the sound of that shotgun barrel hitting the track and the way the man stared at him felt like a knife sinking into his chest. It was the kind of moment where your instincts scream that you are in real danger. That was when he decided silence no longer mattered. He turned to his friend and shouted for him to run. They sprinted through the woods as fast as they could, crashing through brush and branches without worrying about noise anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting back to the truck. When they reached the clearing where they had parked, they jumped into the vehicle and drove away immediately. They didn't stop until they had reached a larger town miles away. The rest of the night they stayed awake, trying to process what had happened. Later, after they had returned home, my roommate started researching the area online. What he found made the story even more unsettling. There had been reports of violent crimes in that region over the years, including murders and a rape case not far from where they had been camping. He also learned something else from locals. Apparently, some people in that area had a reputation for targeting campers. And sometimes they would vandalize vehicles left in remote areas, breaking windows or even pushing unattended trucks off nearby cliffs. Whether the men they encountered that night were connected to any of those incidents, he couldn't say. But one thing he was certain about was that those men were not out there hunting animals. Hunters carry lights. They move openly through the forest. They follow known trails. The men he saw were moving quietly in the dark, spreading out through the trees and carrying weapons. That was enough to convince him that whatever they were doing in those woods, it wasn't something he wanted to be part of. My roommate never went back to that area again, and he told me that story in such a serious tone that it stuck with me ever since. Whenever people talk about how peaceful and safe nature can be, I always remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter in the wilderness isn't wildlife. It's other people. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. A few years ago, something happened that left a lasting impression on me, even though at the time it seemed like just another day of house hunting. Looking back now, I can still remember how strange the whole experience felt. Some places simply carry an atmosphere that makes people uncomfortable, even if they cannot explain why. That day, we stepped into one of those places. At the time, my boyfriend's mother had decided to buy a house in the small town where we were living. Her idea was simple. She would purchase a property, and we would rent it from her. It would help us get started with our own place while also giving her a long-term investment. On paper, it sounded like a good arrangement. The town itself was very small and had a lot of history. It was one of those old communities where many of the buildings had been standing for decades. The area had originally been settled by Ukrainian immigrants, and traces of that heritage were still everywhere. Some of the architecture reflected Eastern European styles, and older residents sometimes told stories about the town's early days. But alongside that history, the town also had a number of abandoned buildings. There was an old theater that had been closed for years, its faded sign still hanging over the entrance. There was also a hospital building that people often talked about as being haunted. Whether those stories were true or not, the empty structures gave parts of the town a slightly eerie feeling. Still, we didn't think much about that while searching for houses. One afternoon, we went to look at a property that had recently become available. According to what we had heard, a man had been living there for quite a long time. The house technically belonged to his parents, but he had stayed there alone. My boyfriend, Jack, told me that the man had struggled with serious mental health issues. From what he understood, the parents eventually moved him somewhere else so he could receive proper care. After that, the house had been left empty. When we arrived, the place looked older than most of the other houses we had seen. The paint was faded. The yard was overgrown. The windows were dusty, and the front steps creaked when we walked up to the door. It didn't look completely abandoned, but it clearly hadn't been maintained well. When we stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was writing on the doors. On almost every door inside the house, someone had painted affirmations directly onto the wood. You are beautiful. Life is what you make it. Love unconditionally. There were many messages like that. Some were written in large letters, others smaller and squeezed into corners. At first, I thought the idea behind them was kind of sad rather than frightening. It seemed like someone had been trying very hard to remind themselves of positive things. But the rest of the house told a different story. The rooms were dim even during the daytime. Dust covered most surfaces. Furniture was missing from many areas, and the walls showed signs of wear and damage. It felt like a place that had been lived in by someone who had gradually lost the ability to keep things organized or clean. While I wandered around the main floor, Jack said he wanted to see what was downstairs. The house had a basement. I've never liked basements very much. Something about them makes me uncomfortable, especially in older houses. They tend to be dark, cold, and full of strange noises that echo through pipes and wood beams. So when Jack mentioned going downstairs, I told him I would stay on the main level. He headed down the basement steps while I continued walking through the rooms upstairs. A few minutes passed quietly. Then suddenly I heard him shout. He called my name and told me I had to come downstairs and see something. His voice sounded serious enough that I couldn't ignore it. Reluctantly, I walked toward the basement stairs and began heading down. The moment I reached the bottom step, I realized the basement was unlike anything I had seen before. The entire floor was dirt. Not just patches of dirt, but the entire surface. It looked like the ground had never been finished with concrete. Instead, piles of soil were scattered throughout the space. Some of the piles looked freshly moved. In one of them, a shovel was sticking out of the dirt. There were also a few freestanding shelves along one wall. On those shelves sat several jars filled with things I couldn't clearly identify. Some appeared to contain liquids, others strange objects that had been preserved inside. The whole place smelled damp and earthy. Then I noticed something even stranger. A makeshift wooden barrier had been built across part of the basement. It looked like someone had taken pieces of plywood and pushed them vertically into the dirt floor, creating a narrow pathway that stretched from one end of the basement toward the back of the house. It wasn't a proper wall, just rough boards forming a corridor. Jack was standing at the far end of that path. He gestured for me to walk over. I followed the wooden corridor slowly, feeling increasingly uneasy with every step. The boards were uneven, and the narrow walkway made the basement feel almost like a maze. At the end of the path, there was a small room. There was no door. Instead, a red sheet hung from the ceiling where the doorway should have been. The sheet had been pulled aside and nailed to the cement wall, leaving the entrance exposed. Jack pointed inside. When I looked into the room, my stomach dropped. There was almost nothing inside. A mattress lay directly on the floor. Next to it stood a small side table covered with crumpled pieces of paper. Above the table hung a light bulb with a red tint. The bulb wasn't actively glowing, but the light fixture itself was still on. The bulb was swinging slowly back and forth as if someone had recently brushed against it. The movement made shadows shift across the walls. The entire setup looked deeply disturbing. The first thought that entered my mind was that it resembled the kind of place you might see in a crime movie where someone had been held captive. I felt a wave of fear rise through my chest. My heart began racing, and before I could stop myself, I started crying. I turned around immediately, walked back through the wooden corridor, climbed the stairs, and left the house without looking back. I stood outside trying to calm down while Jack finished looking around inside. When he came out, I told him very clearly that I didn't want anything to do with that house. But the problem was that the decision wasn't ours alone. His mother was the one buying the property. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that basement again. The dirt floor, the shovel, the red light swinging in that small room. Even though I'm not a spiritual person, and I don't normally believe in supernatural things, I became convinced that something about that place felt wrong. The next day, I went out and bought candles, stones, and bundles of sage. I had heard people talk about cleansing spaces with smoke, and rituals meant to clear negative energy. Normally, I would never have taken that idea seriously, but I was desperate to shake the feeling that had followed me home. Eventually, sometime late that night, I finally fell asleep. And then I had a dream. In the dream, I was back inside that house. I walked through the front door and into the living room. Everything looked exactly the way it had earlier that day. The same dim lighting, the same worn floors, the same unsettling atmosphere. Then I noticed someone standing in the room. A little girl. She was wearing a beautiful red dress. The color was bright and vivid, standing out against the dull background of the house. She looked calm and gentle, almost peaceful. She reached her hand out toward me. Without thinking, I took it. She gently pulled me downward until I was kneeling in front of her. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You cannot move into this house," she said. "Do not move into this house." The moment she finished speaking, I woke up. My heart was pounding. I immediately woke Jack and told him about the dream. I also told him something else very clearly. If he expected me to live in that house, our relationship would end before that happened. I wasn't willing to move into a place that had made me feel that frightened. In the end, we never moved there. And even now, whenever I think back to that basement, and the strange room at the end of that narrow wooden corridor, I feel the same chill that ran through me that day. Several years ago, I worked as an art teacher at an elementary school. My classes included very young students, mostly kindergarten and first grade. Teaching children that age can be both wonderful and unpredictable. Their imagination is powerful, their honesty is unfiltered, and the things they say often stay with you long after the school day ends. One activity I liked to do with the younger classes was a drawing exercise that helped them talk about their feelings. Children sometimes struggle to explain what scares them or what worries them, but when they draw something, they can express it more easily. Art gives them a language that doesn't require complicated words. So one day I decided to try a simple assignment. I handed out paper and crayons and asked each child to draw something that scared them. Afterward, we would talk about their drawings together. Well, the goal wasn't to frighten anyone, but to give them a chance to talk about fears in a safe and supportive environment. When children talk openly about things that scare them, those fears often become easier to manage. At first, the activity went exactly the way I expected. Many of the drawings showed things that are very common childhood fears. Several children drew spiders with exaggerated legs stretching across the page. Others drew monsters that looked like characters from movies or cartoons. One child even drew a large, shadowy shape hiding under a bed. As I walked around the classroom, I knelt beside each student and asked them to explain their drawings. Some kids laughed while talking about their pictures, turning their fears into jokes. Others were a little more serious, describing nightmares or things they imagined hiding in dark corners. The classroom felt lively and normal. Now, it was the kind of lesson that teachers enjoy because it lets children express themselves creatively, while also opening small conversations about emotions. Then I came to one particular student. She was a quiet little girl who usually kept to herself during class. She was polite and attentive, but she didn't talk much compared to some of the other children. When I approached her desk, she looked up at me and held out her drawing. The picture immediately caught my attention. It was done entirely in crayon like the others, but something about it felt different. Instead of drawing an obvious monster with bright colors or exaggerated features, she had drawn a single face. The face filled most of the page. It had large, hollow-looking eyes and an oddly shaped mouth. The lines were rough and uneven, but there was a strange intensity in the way she had drawn it. The crayon marks were heavy in some areas, almost as if she had pressed down harder while making certain parts. I knelt beside her and asked the same question I had asked every other student. "Can you tell me about your drawing?" She didn't smile the way the other children had. Instead, she looked at the paper and then back at me. Her answer was simple. "This visits me at night," she said. I asked her what she meant. She pointed to the drawing. "It comes over my bed," she explained. "I tell my parents, but they don't believe me." Her voice was calm, not dramatic or playful, and she spoke about it as if she were describing something ordinary that happened regularly. That moment made me pause. When you work with young children, you quickly learn that their imagination is incredibly vivid. Many children describe dreams or nighttime fears as if they are real experiences. They might talk about shadows turning into creatures or noises in the house becoming monsters. But the way this girl spoke felt different from the usual playful storytelling. She seemed serious. I gently asked a few more questions, trying to understand what she meant without making her feel uncomfortable. I asked if she saw the face in her dreams or if it appeared when she was awake. She told me it came when she was lying in bed at night. She said it would hover over her, Again, she repeated that she had told her parents about it, but they didn't believe her. In a classroom full of young children, moments like that can be tricky. You have to be careful about how you respond. You don't want to dismiss what a child says because their feelings are real to them. But you also don't want to reinforce fears that could make their anxiety worse. So I reassured her gently. I told her that sometimes our brains create images when we are tired or dreaming, and that it can feel very real even when it isn't. I encouraged her to talk with her parents again and let them know how she felt at night. She nodded quietly and returned to coloring her picture. But the image stayed with me. After class ended and the students went home, I gathered the drawings from the activity. Most of them were exactly what you would expect from kindergarten students. Colorful, exaggerated monsters, silly creatures, and playful drawings, but her picture stood out. Even though it was made with simple crayons on paper, the expression on that face had an unsettling quality to it. It wasn't just a typical cartoon monster. The features looked oddly human, but distorted in a way that made it hard to forget. I kept the drawing. Teachers often keep student artwork for various reasons. Sometimes it becomes part of a portfolio, sometimes it's used for classroom displays, and sometimes it simply sticks with you as an example of how children see the world. Over the years, I have occasionally looked back at that picture. And every time I do, I remember that moment in the classroom when she described the face visiting her at night. Of course, there are many possible explanations. Children sometimes experience very vivid nightmares or sleep disturbances. Conditions like night terrors or sleep paralysis can cause frightening visual experiences when a child is waking up or falling asleep. In those moments, the brain can project images that feel completely real. There is also the possibility that the drawing represented something symbolic rather than literal. Children sometimes transform difficult experiences into imaginary creatures. If a child feels scared or unsafe in some way, their mind might create a monster to represent that fear. Psychologists often see this in children who are trying to process confusing emotions or situations they don't fully understand yet. Another explanation could be simple imagination. You see, young children's minds are incredibly creative, and sometimes they develop recurring characters in their dreams or thoughts that feel very real to them. But even knowing all of that, the drawing still gives me a strange feeling whenever I see it. Maybe it's because of the seriousness in her voice when she talked about it. Or maybe it's because the image itself carries a kind of raw, emotional energy that children sometimes put into their art without realizing it. Either way, it was one of those moments in teaching that stays with you. Working with children means you occasionally glimpse the mysterious way their minds interpret the world around them. Their fears, dreams, and imagination often blend together in ways adults don't always understand. That day reminded me that even simple classroom activities can reveal how complex a child's inner world can be. And somewhere in a folder of old classroom materials, I still have that crayon drawing of the strange face hovering over a little girl's bed. Several years ago, I worked in a call center. And during that time, I experienced something that still confuses me when I think back on it. It wasn't something dramatic like a fire or a robbery, but it was strange enough that the entire office talked about it for days afterward. Even now, whenever I remember it, I still feel the same uncomfortable curiosity I felt the first time I heard the recording. Call centers are interesting places to work. At first glance, they seem ordinary. Rows of desks with computers, headsets, hanging from monitors, and agents quietly speaking into microphones while typing on keyboards. But beneath that calm surface, there is constant noise. Phones ringing, people talking to customers, supervisors walking around helping agents solve problems. It's an environment where something is always happening. Most of the calls we handled were routine customer service issues. People calling to ask about their accounts, request information, or solve billing problems. Sometimes callers were frustrated or angry, but that was normal for the job. Anyone who works in customer service learns quickly that not every conversation will be pleasant. One afternoon, I was sitting at my desk handling calls like usual when I noticed a commotion across the office. One of the agents had suddenly become very upset. From where I was sitting, I could see her at her workstation. She had taken off her headset and looked shaken, almost like she was about to cry. A supervisor had quickly walked over to her desk and picked up the phone to see what was happening with the call. A few seconds later, he hung up. The whole thing happened quickly. The supervisor said something quietly to the agent, and she nodded while trying to compose herself. From a distance, it looked like the kind of situation that sometimes happens when a customer becomes extremely rude or aggressive on the phone. That kind of thing, unfortunately, isn't rare in call centers. Sometimes people call while angry and say things they normally wouldn't say face-to-face. So at the time, I didn't think much about it. I assumed the girl had just received a particularly unpleasant call. The rest of the day continued normally. Phones rang, agents handled their conversations, and the small incident faded into the background of a busy office. But the next day, something unexpected happened. One of the supervisors approached my desk and asked me to come with him for a moment. He said he wanted me to listen to something. I followed him to a small room where supervisors sometimes reviewed recorded calls. Most call centers record conversations for training and quality assurance purposes. Supervisors often use those recordings to show examples of good customer service or to help agents improve their communication. When we entered the room, the supervisor told me he wanted to play a call from the previous day. He said it was the one that had upset the agent I had seen across the office. At first, I expected to hear the voice of an angry customer yelling or saying something inappropriate. Instead, the call started completely normal. The recording began with the agent answering the phone politely. Her tone was calm and professional, just like it should be. The customer on the other end responded normally as well. They spoke briefly about the reason for the call, and nothing seemed unusual. Then the agent placed the customer on hold for a short moment while she checked something in the system. That part of the recording sounded routine, too. A few seconds later, she returned to the call and said something like, "Thank you for holding." And that's when things changed. Instead of a normal response from the customer, the audio suddenly filled with a strange sound, growling. And at first I thought maybe the recording was distorted or picking up background noise. But the sound was very clear. It didn't sound like a human voice. It was low, rough, and almost animal-like. The closest comparison I could think of was something you might hear in a horror movie when a creature growls at a character. The agent tried to continue the conversation. She asked if the customer was still on the line. The growling continued. It sounded deep and aggressive, like something angry responding from the other side of the phone. As the agent kept speaking, the sound seemed to grow louder and more intense. The longer she tried to communicate, the more agitated the noise became. The supervisor and I sat there in silence listening to the recording. It was unsettling, not because we believed anything supernatural was happening, but because the sound simply didn't resemble normal human speech. For several minutes, the call continued like that. The agent kept trying to ask questions and confirm whether the customer could hear her. Meanwhile, the growling sounds kept responding in a way that sounded almost reactive to her voice. Eventually, the agent became overwhelmed. You could hear the tension in her voice as she tried to stay professional, but it was obvious that the situation was making her nervous. After about 5 minutes, she stopped speaking and asked for help from her supervisor. That was the moment I had seen the previous day when she removed her headset. The supervisor then took over the call. In the recording, you could hear him introduce himself calmly and explain that he was the supervisor. He told the caller that if there was a problem with the connection, they would disconnect the call and try to call back. Then he ended the call. What happened next made the situation even stranger. The supervisor immediately called the customer back. When the customer answered the phone, everything sounded completely normal. The man on the other end spoke clearly and calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened during the previous call. His voice sounded ordinary, polite, and perfectly understandable. There was no growling, no strange sounds, just a normal conversation. The supervisor asked if the customer had experienced any connection problems earlier, and the man responded casually, saying he hadn't noticed anything unusual. After listening to the entire recording, I looked at the supervisor, unsure what to say. We both tried to come up with explanations. One possibility was a technical issue. Phone lines can sometimes produce strange distortions or audio glitches, especially if there is interference somewhere in the connection. Certain types of electronic feedback can create noises that sound very unnatural. Another possibility was that the customer had been using some kind of voice-changing device or application. Now, with modern technology, people can alter their voices in real time to produce strange effects. But the strange part was that when the supervisor called the customer back, the man's voice sounded completely normal. There was no sign that he had been intentionally making those sounds. Some people in the office joked that it sounded like something supernatural, like a demon from a horror movie. Of course, no one actually believed that explanation. But the recording was unusual enough that it became a strange little mystery among the staff. The agent who had taken the call was shaken by the experience. Hearing those sounds through a headset while trying to maintain a professional conversation must have been very unsettling. After that day, the supervisors used the recording mainly as an example of how unpredictable customer service calls can be. Sometimes agents expect rude customers or technical questions, but occasionally they encounter something completely unexpected. Looking back now, I still think the most likely explanation was some kind of technical interference. Phone networks involve many layers of digital and analog signals, and sometimes strange audio artifacts can occur. But hearing that recording for the first time definitely left an impression. It reminded me that even in a normal office environment, something strange can occasionally break the routine in ways you don't expect. And sometimes those moments leave behind questions that never get completely answered. When people talk about strange childhood memories, I often think about two experiences that stayed with my family for years. One involved my older sister when she was very young, and the other happened to me much later in life in the form of a dream so realistic that it took hours for my body to calm down afterward. Neither story has a clear explanation, but both left a deep impression on the people who experienced them. The first story happened when my older sister was around 4 years old. At that age, children are still learning how to separate imagination from reality. Their dreams can feel incredibly vivid, and sometimes fears develop around things that adults might not even notice. But my sister's behavior during that period was unusual enough that it caught my parents' attention. At the time, our family was living in an older house. It wasn't particularly large, but it had been standing for decades. Like many older homes, it had a few quirks: creaky floorboards, uneven door frames, and a layout that felt slightly different from newer houses. The bedroom my sister slept in was one of the smaller rooms in the house. It had a window that faced the backyard and a closet against the far wall. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then my sister started waking up at night. At first, it seemed like the typical nighttime fears many young children experience. She would call out to my parents, saying she was scared or that she didn't want to sleep alone. My parents would go into the room, comfort her, and reassure her that everything was fine. But the pattern continued night after night. Eventually, she began describing why she was afraid. She told my parents that there was someone in her room. More specifically, she said there was an old man near the window and sometimes in the closet. According to her description, the man looked very old. She said his face was wrinkled and that he wore strange, old-looking clothes. She insisted that he appeared at night and watched her. As you might expect, my parents initially assumed this was simply an imaginary fear. Children often create imaginary characters or monsters to explain unfamiliar sounds or shadows in the dark. It's a common stage of childhood development. But what made the situation unsettling was how detailed her descriptions were. She didn't just say there was a monster. She consistently described an elderly man. She talked about his face, his clothing, and the way he stood near the window. Sometimes she said he moved around the room. There were nights when she refused to sleep because she said the man was there again. My parents tried everything they could think of to reassure her. They checked the room, turned on lights, and explained that there was nothing there. Eventually, they assumed the problem would fade with time as she grew older. Then, several months later, something unexpected happened. My mother was speaking with someone in the neighborhood about the history of the house. It was a casual conversation about the previous owners and the people who had lived there before our family moved in. During that conversation, my mother learned something disturbing. About 10 years before we moved into the house, a man had died in that same bedroom. According to what she was told, he had been around 65 years old, and he had taken his own life in that room. When my mother heard that information, she felt a chill run through her. She later said that the description my sister had given of the old man sounded very similar to the age of the person who had died there. Of course, there are many logical explanations for what happened. Children often hear fragments of conversations without adults realizing it. It's possible that my sister overheard someone mention the house's history at some point and then incorporated that information into her imagination. It's also possible that the story she told about the man was simply a child's way of describing normal nighttime fears. But at the time, learning about the man who had died in that room made the situation feel very unsettling for my parents. Eventually, my sister stopped talking about the man. As she got older, the nighttime fears disappeared, and she slept normally again. But the memory of those months stayed with the family. The second experience I want to talk about happened to me personally years later. It was a dream, but it was unlike any dream I had experienced before. Most dreams feel blurry or unrealistic when you wake up. The details fade quickly, and sometimes you can barely remember them at all. But this particular dream felt incredibly real from beginning to end. In the dream, I was standing somewhere I didn't immediately recognize. It felt like an ordinary place, maybe a street or an open area, though the exact surroundings are hard to recall now. Suddenly, something happened. I was shot. The sensation was immediate and intense. In the dream, I felt a sharp impact in my head, followed by an overwhelming wave of pain. It wasn't the vague kind of discomfort you sometimes experience in dreams. It felt specific and physical. as if my brain had created a detailed simulation of what that kind of injury might feel like. I collapsed to the ground. The pain was unbearable. I remember trying to move, trying to scream for help, but something was wrong with my body. My muscles didn't seem to respond correctly. When I tried to shout, the sounds that came out were weak and distorted. My body began twitching uncontrollably. It felt like my brain was losing control over my movements. I was aware that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't fix it. The sensation of panic grew stronger as my vision began to fade. Everything around me started growing darker and blurrier. At the same time, I noticed a strange numbness spreading through my body. The feeling began in my legs. Slowly, it traveled upward, moving through my torso and arms. It was like parts of my body were shutting down one by one. I remember thinking that I was dying. The numbness continued rising until it reached my neck. My vision had narrowed so much that I could barely see anything at all. The world around me was fading into darkness. Then everything went black, and I woke up. The moment I opened my eyes, I realized something strange. My head hurt. It wasn't just the dull discomfort you sometimes feel after waking from a bad dream. It was a strong headache, centered around the same area where I had been shot in the dream. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't hold them still. I sat up in bed trying to calm down, but the adrenaline in my body wouldn't fade. For hours afterward, I couldn't stop shaking. Even though I knew it had been a dream, the memory of the pain and the loss of control over my body felt disturbingly real. Later, I learned that extremely vivid dreams can sometimes trigger physical sensations. If someone has a headache or tension while sleeping, the brain may incorporate that sensation into the dream narrative. The dream then builds a story around the feeling. Sleep paralysis and night terrors can also create powerful experiences where people feel trapped in their own bodies or unable to move. But in that moment, lying awake in the darkness with my heart pounding and my hands trembling, none of those explanations mattered. All I knew was that the dream had felt real enough to make my body react as if it had actually happened. Even now, years later, I can still remember the sequence of sensations from that dream. The impact, the pain, the twitching, and the slow fading of feeling as my vision disappeared. Both of these stories, the one about my sister and the one about my dream, remind me how powerful the human mind can be. Children's imaginations can create vivid characters that feel real to them. And the brain during sleep can generate experiences so detailed that they temporarily blur the line between dream and reality. Even though there are likely rational explanations behind both events, the memories themselves remain vivid reminders of how strange our minds can be when faced with fear, imagination, and the mysteries of sleep. A few years ago, I had an experience at work that I still find difficult to explain. I have never been someone who believes easily in ghosts or supernatural stories. In fact, I have always been fairly skeptical about that sort of thing. Whenever people talk about haunted buildings or strange paranormal encounters, my first instinct is usually to look for a logical explanation. That is why what happened during that job stayed with me. Even now, when I think back on those nights, I still try to come up with a rational explanation for everything I experienced. Maybe there is one. But at the time, the series of small incidents was strange enough that it made me question what I thought I understood about perception and environment. At the time, I was working for a rental car company. My job was in the wash bay where the vehicles were cleaned and prepared before being returned to the airport lot. The facility itself wasn't unusual. It was a fairly standard building located near the airport, about 20 years old, according to what I had been told. The layout was simple. There was a small office area connected to a large garage-like space where the cars were washed, vacuumed, and detailed. Most of my shifts were at night. Night shifts in that kind of job can be very quiet. During the daytime, the facility would be busy with cars coming in and out, employees moving around, and supervisors checking on the progress of the work. But at night, especially late at night, the place could feel almost empty. Many times I was working there completely by myself. At first, I actually liked that about the job. When you work alone, you can focus on your tasks without a lot of distractions. I would usually put on some music, move from one vehicle to the next, and work through the list of cars that needed to be cleaned before morning. The wash bay itself was a large concrete area with drains in the floor. Water from the washing process would often leave thin puddles that reflected the overhead lights. The sound of vacuums and running water echoed slightly against the walls, but once the equipment was turned off, the space became very quiet. The first strange thing happened one night while I was vacuuming the inside of a car. I was lying partly in the back seat area, leaning forward with the vacuum hose while cleaning the carpets. My focus was on the floor of the car, so my view of the surrounding space was limited. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone walking past the vehicle. It happened quickly. The movement was clear enough that I immediately assumed someone had entered the wash bay. Maybe my boss had come by to check on things, or maybe another employee had stopped in for some reason. I pulled myself out of the car and looked around. The wash bay was empty. At first I thought maybe the person had walked into the office area. So I went inside to check. The office was empty too. I walked around the building once more just to be sure. There was no one there. After a moment, I shrugged it off and went back to work. When you're alone late at night, it's easy for your eyes to misinterpret movement. Shadows shift. When lights reflect off wet floors, reflections from passing cars outside can move across windows. I assumed it was probably something like that. The next strange moment happened a few nights later. Again, I was working alone. This time I had stepped into the bathroom to wash my hands after finishing a car. While I was in there, I heard the door to the wash bay slam shut. Right afterward, I heard footsteps. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking across the wet floor of the wash bay. When shoes move through shallow water, they make a very distinct splashing sound. I assumed my boss had arrived again. Thinking he might want to talk about something, I quickly finished washing my hands and stepped out of the bathroom. The wash bay was empty. There was no one there. For a moment, I stood still, listening. Nothing. The building was silent again. I felt a brief sense of unease, but I reminded myself that buildings make strange noises sometimes. Doors can close if air pressure changes. Water can drip in ways that echo across large spaces. It's easy for the brain to interpret those sounds as footsteps when you're expecting to hear someone nearby. So I pushed the thought aside and continued working. But similar moments kept happening. Once, while I was cleaning the exterior of a car, I saw what looked like someone walking past the vehicle again. Just a quick glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look, there was no one there. Each time something like that happened, I told myself the same thing. It was probably just my imagination. A few days later, I was out with a friend who also worked at the same company. He was actually the one who helped me get the job in the first place. We were sitting together talking about work when he asked how things were going. I told him the job was fine. The work itself was pretty easy once you got used to the routine. Then I hesitated. I mentioned that sometimes working nights felt a little strange. Before I could even finish explaining what I meant, he interrupted me. "Seeing weird stuff at night?" he asked. The way he said it made me pause. I asked him how he knew what I was about to say. He laughed and told me that another friend of his had worked the same night shift before I started there. According to him, that guy had also complained about strange things happening while he worked alone. He said the previous employee would sometimes see movement when no one was around or hear sounds in the building when it should have been empty. Eventually, that guy asked to switch to the day shift. Not long after that, he left the job entirely. Hearing that story made me feel slightly uneasy, but again I tried to stay logical about it. When people work alone at night in large buildings, it's easy for small sounds and visual tricks to play with their perception. Still, it was interesting that someone else had experienced similar things. About a month later, I accepted a new job that offered better pay. Before leaving, I spent some time training the person who would replace me. During one of our last shifts together, something happened that puzzled me more than anything else before. I had just finished cleaning the interior of a car and stepped out of the driver's side door. As I closed the door, I heard someone speaking behind me. The voice wasn't loud enough for me to understand the words. It sounded like someone talking quietly, almost like a conversation happening on a phone call. I didn't turn around immediately. In the corner of the wash bay, there was a wall-mounted phone. That phone was connected directly to the rental counter at the airport. Sometimes employees would use it to speak with the agents working the counter, especially if they needed to coordinate which cars would be ready in the morning. So I assumed the new employee I was training had picked up the phone and was talking with someone at the airport counter. But when I looked up, I saw him. He was about 50 feet away in the back of the parking lot. He was locking up the vehicles outside before we closed for the night. He wasn't anywhere near the phone. Confused, I turned around to see who had been speaking. There was no one in the wash bay. The phone was hanging on the wall exactly where it always was. Silent. I stood there for a moment trying to process what had just happened. Even now, I still don't know exactly what caused those experiences. There are many possible explanations. Large buildings near airports can pick up strange echoes from nearby activity. Sounds can travel through pipes or ventilation systems in surprising ways. Reflections and lighting can create illusions of movement that fool the eyes. But those nights remain some of the most unusual moments I experienced while working there. Not because I believe the building was haunted, but because sometimes our senses can produce experiences that don't immediately fit into easy explanations. And when that happens, the memory tends to stay with you. A strange experience happened to me many years ago in the house where my family used to live. Even now, when I think back on it, I still cannot fully explain what happened that night, or some of the other things that occurred in that house over the years. I have always tried to be a practical person, someone who prefers logical explanations instead of jumping to supernatural conclusions. But there were moments in that house that were unsettling enough that they stayed with me long after I moved away. The house itself was not particularly unusual at first glance. It was an older home, but nothing about it immediately suggested anything strange. It had 2 main floors and a basement area. My father's bedroom was upstairs, and I had a space in the basement where I eventually made my own room. Like many older houses, it had its share of creaks and noises. The wooden floors made small sounds when someone walked across them, and the stairs had a few spots that squeaked more loudly than others. Over time, living there every day, I became very familiar with those sounds. I knew exactly what it sounded like when someone walked from one room to another. I knew which step on the staircase creaked the most. I even knew the sound my father's bed made when he got up in the morning. Those small details become surprisingly clear when you live in a place long enough. One particular night, something happened that I still remember vividly. I was in the house when I suddenly noticed someone moving through one of the rooms. At first, I assumed it was just someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The movement caught my attention immediately. And when I looked more carefully, I saw what appeared to be a man walking quickly through the house. He was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. His hair was tied back in a brown ponytail. I didn't recognize him at all. For a moment, I was confused. My father was home, but I knew exactly what he looked like. And this was not him. The man I saw was definitely someone else. As soon as he realized I had noticed him, he ran. Instinctively, I chased after him. He ran up the stairs toward my father's room and then slammed the door shut behind him. The sudden noise of the door closing echoed through the hallway. At that moment, my mind immediately jumped to the most obvious possibility. Someone had broken into the house. I didn't want to take any chances. I grabbed a gun and walked carefully toward the door to my father's room. My heart was pounding as I reached for the handle. Then I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was empty. I searched everywhere. I looked behind the door, inside the closet, under the bed, and around every corner of the room. I even checked the windows to see if someone had somehow climbed out. There was no one there. The room had no other exit. There was simply no way for a person to disappear from that space in the few seconds between the door slamming and me entering the room. For a long time, I stood there trying to figure out what had just happened. I was certain about what I had seen. The image of the man running up the stairs was clear in my mind. I could still picture the white shirt and the brown ponytail. But there was no trace of anyone. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. Perhaps the lighting in the hallway or the shadows in the house had made something look like a person moving. Still, the memory stuck with me. Years passed, and eventually I moved away from that house. Life continued, and the strange incident slowly faded into the background of my memories. Much later, after moving back to Texas, I went to visit my half-brother. During that visit, my former stepmother, and my former stepsister were also there. At some point, the conversation turned to old stories about the house we used to live in. That's when I casually mentioned that I'd always felt like something strange had happened there. I said that at times the place almost felt haunted. My stepsister immediately looked curious when I said that. She asked me if I could describe the person I thought I had seen in the house. But instead of saying it out loud, she asked me to whisper the description into her ear. I thought that was a little odd, but I did it anyway. I quietly told her exactly what I had seen that night. A man wearing a white t-shirt and jeans with brown hair tied back in a ponytail. After I finished, she turned to her mother and asked her to describe the man she had once seen standing over their bed while they were asleep. Her mother began describing him. As she spoke, I felt a chill run through me. The description was the same. She described a man wearing a white t-shirt and jeans with brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. For a moment, none of us said anything. It was one of those moments where everyone in the room realizes something unusual has just happened. Neither of us had told the other about our experiences before that conversation, yet the descriptions matched perfectly. That wasn't the only strange thing about that house. As I mentioned earlier, I eventually made a room for myself in the basement. My father slept upstairs, and the floor between us was the main living area of the house. Because I had lived there for so long, I knew exactly how the house sounded at night. I knew when my father got up from his bed. His mattress made a very specific sound when he moved. The wooden frame creaked slightly, and the floorboards in the hallway outside his room would squeak as he walked. Those sounds were familiar to me, but sometimes, late at night, I would hear footsteps moving across the floor above me. The strange part was that I could clearly hear my father still in his room. I knew the sound of his bed, and I could tell when he was still lying down. Yet the footsteps would continue across the floor between us. Slow, steady steps moving from one end of the room to the other. Each time I heard it, I would lie there quietly, listening, trying to figure out what could be causing the sound. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe it was pipes shifting in the walls. Maybe it was simply my imagination playing tricks on me in the quiet darkness of the night. But the footsteps always sounded deliberate, like someone walking calmly through the room. Over time, I learned to ignore it. Eventually, I moved away, and life moved on. Even now, though, I still remember those moments clearly. The man running up the stairs, the empty room, the matching description years later, and the quiet footsteps moving across the floor when no one should have been there. I still don't claim that the house was haunted. There are many things in life that can feel mysterious without actually being supernatural. Old houses make strange noises. Our brains sometimes fill in details when we think we see movement. Memory itself can be tricky. But those experiences were real to me at the time. And even after all these years, they remain some of the strangest moments I have ever experienced inside a house that, on the surface, looked completely ordinary. One of the scariest things I've ever experienced happened when I worked in retail. My store offered layaway, and I worked right at the layaway counter. It was a fairly normal job most days, just helping customers set up or pick up their orders, dealing with paperwork, and occasionally answering questions from other employees. But one day, something happened that has stayed with me ever since. Right by the layaway counter, the store had 3 bathrooms, a men's multi-stall restroom, a women's multi-stall restroom, and a family bathroom. The men's and women's bathrooms had swinging push-and-pull doors that never fully locked. The family bathroom, on the other hand, had a solid door with a lock designed for privacy. You couldn't open it from the outside without a key. I had passed by it countless times and never thought twice about it until that day. I was in the back cleaning up a small pile of boxes and organizing the layaway paperwork when I thought I heard screaming. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss, but then it became louder, more frantic. My stomach dropped. This wasn't the usual crying or whining from a child lost in the store. It was something different. Panicked, desperate, chaotic. I walked out to the front near the counter to see if I could figure out where it was coming from. The screaming intensified as I got closer, and it was unmistakably coming from the bathroom area. My first thought was that a child had wandered in somewhere alone and was upset. I ran to the men's restroom and pushed through the door, empty. The women's restroom, also empty. But the screaming didn't stop. So it was louder now, echoing across the tile floors, and there was something in the sound that made my heart pound. It wasn't just crying. It was yelling, frantic, banging, terror. I turned to the family bathroom. The door was closed and locked. I pounded on it as hard as I could and shouted, asking if anyone was okay, but the sounds kept going. A child's voice crying and screaming, mixed with banging. I had no way of getting in. My hands were shaking. I called for a manager immediately. By the time my manager arrived, the screaming had become unbearable. It felt like every second was stretched into an eternity. We tried to open the door ourselves, shaking the handle, banging, shouting, but nothing worked. The child's cries continued relentlessly. At that moment, all we could do was hope someone had the right key or that the child would calm down, but neither happened. Finally, after multiple failed attempts, we called 911. The dispatcher asked us to stay calm, but I don't think anyone in the store could be calm at that point. Every passing second of that screaming felt like it would never end. I remember standing there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, feeling completely helpless. The noise was raw, primal, and so close I could almost feel the child's fear in the air. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Just like that. No crying, no banging, no screams. Silence. The abruptness made it worse. Silence after that kind of chaos felt heavier than the noise itself. We pounded on the door again, shouting, desperate, until the police arrived. When the officers got there, they quickly assessed the situation and realized we had no key. They had to kick the door in. The sound of the door crashing open echoed through the store. I froze. Inside, the scene was horrifying. Blood was everywhere, smeared across the floor, streaked on the walls, pooling near the sink. My stomach turned. I could hardly process what I was seeing. Then the officers pulled out a woman in handcuffs, her clothes soaked in blood. Behind her, another officer carried a small child, maybe 3 years old. The boy was covered in blood and completely still. For a moment, I was certain he was dead. We all stood there in shock. Nobody spoke. The store felt frozen in time. I could only stare, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding in front of me. Paramedics rushed in and took the child away, and the woman was led off in handcuffs. Yeah, it was all happening so fast and yet so painfully slow. Later, after we had given our statements, my manager explained what the police had told them. The child had been crying nonstop, and the woman, his mother, had snapped. She did whatever she could to make him stop crying, hitting him so hard that he lost consciousness. That explained why the screaming suddenly stopped. Miraculously, the child survived, though the images of blood and panic will stay with me forever. What made this moment so terrifying wasn't ghosts or shadows or anything supernatural. It was the helplessness. Being right there, hearing a child in terror just behind a locked door, and having no way to help. Not knowing if they were okay, not knowing if the next moment would be worse. That feeling, that helpless, heart-pounding fear, is something I've never forgotten. Even years later. Whenever I hear a child cry in that same pitch or tone, I'm instantly transported back to that hallway, standing at that locked door, praying I could do something, but knowing there was nothing I could do. Real fear isn't always about the unknown. Sometimes it's knowing how fragile life can be, how quickly a normal day can turn into a nightmare, and how powerless you can feel when someone else's pain is happening right in front of you. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.